Hello, everyone. Welcome to the International Labour Organization. My name is Martin Murphy. I'm with the Department of Communications here at the ILO. And with me is ILO Director-General Mr. Guy Ryder. We just finished 2 very busy weeks here at the ILO. We had the International Labour Conference, which finished on Friday. And we thought that it'd be very interesting to sit down with the DG, spend some time talking about what happened over this past 2 weeks. So, DG, thank you very much for taking the time. It's been a very hectic, busy 2 weeks, but also very productive. What's your first reaction to the ILC?
Yeah, Martin, as you say, we got through another year of our conference, what is commonly called the Global Parliament of Labour. 2 weeks in Geneva, we had some 6,000 registered participants in our conference. Gives you an idea of the size of the meeting, people from all of the regions of the world. It's really a great event, and we pack it now into just 2 weeks. We've shortened our conference. So it is a very intense period of work. Now, what did we do? What did we discuss? Well, I think the really encouraging thing is we firstly discussed issues which I think are really important for the world of work, and we'll come to them in a minute. But also we got good results. We adopted a recommendation, as we call them at the ILO, around the role of decent work and jobs in getting people out of crisis and conflict or preventing them from taking place. We had discussions on migration, on climate change, on women, on fundamental principles and rights at work. And the ILO did its normal business of checking up on member states and how they're actually applying conventions that they've signed up for. So I think this was really both a success because we got results and it was relevant. We were talking about things that mattered. So I feel really very positive about the outcome of the conference.
Great. Now, before we start talking about each one of the different topics a bit more in detail, I want to remind our viewers that we're live. And if you want to send in your questions, you can do so via Facebook on the box that's right here on your left, and we'll be happy to answer them here. Now, DG, as every year, the Director General prepares a report that's presented to the conference, that's discussed by the delegates in the plenary sessions. And this year, it was on the green economy. It was called Work in a Changing Climate. Yep. And now, for someone who doesn't know the ILO very well, you know, the ILO deals with world of work issues. Why is the ILO increasingly concerned also with climate change?
Yeah, you're right. You really need to understand this connection. Well, I think for many years, and this organisation was no exception, there was a sort of view that, look, you either have to choose. We're either working to promote jobs and growth and development, or we're trying to protect the planet. And there was a feeling that those two things were in tension, almost contradictory. I think at the ILO, and I would say this has been the product of the last 10 years, we've understood that these things go together very, very closely. If we want to protect jobs in the future, we have to make sure that those jobs, that productive activity, is also respectful of the planet, contributes to environmental sustainability. And this is the whole logic of the green economy and indeed of the ILO's own centenary green initiative. And if you listen to the discussion that took place, this took place in the plenary of our conference, you heard delegate after delegate after delegate, be they from governments, be they from employers, be they from workers, saying, we understand and we want to promote the green agenda because we understand that the success of our enterprise, the interests of our government, the jobs of our working people depend on environmental sustainability. And of course this comes at a very particular time when the Paris Climate Agreement of 2015, it's been questioned in some quarters, but if you listen to the debate here in our conference, you would really have heard the strongest possible expression of support for the Paris Agreement and a real commitment to make it work, including through the contribution of the world of work, because the world of work now has to change. We have to make what we call a just transition to environmental sustainability. Yeah. So decent work can be promoted and the planet protected.
Actually, that's, I mean, you touched upon a concept that I wanted to mention, which was repeated many times by various delegates. You know, the need for a just transition to environmental sustainability. What do we mean by a just transition?
Well, it means getting to environmental sustainability in a way which still promotes employment opportunities and good employment opportunities. You know, there's one phrase in my report which I think is important, which says that, you know, green jobs of the future will not be decent by definition. They will be decent by design. So we have to work We have to make policies to make this fair, just transition work in the way that we want to.
Now, another issue, and you mentioned it briefly when you answered the first question, the ILO came up with a new labor standard, a recommendation called Recommendation 205,
That's
our
right.
newest labor standard, which is, it aims to promote jobs, peace, stability in countries that are coming out of war, disaster, conflict. Why is this recommendation? Well, first of all, what is a recommendation in ILO terms?
Yeah.
And why is this recommendation so significant?
Okay, let's start with the recommendation. You know, one of the things the ILO does is to adopt international labour standards. That's what our conference does. These can either be conventions, which are effectively, if a government chooses to ratify them, an international treaty. They're law, they're binding. And then we have these recommendations, which we adopted this year. And they are advisory. They provide detailed guidance for countries to help them tackle problems or issues that we think are of particular importance. And as you've said, Martin, at this year's conference we decided to look at the role of decent work and employment, both in preventing and recovering from crisis. And that crisis may be a natural disaster, or it could be a conflict, a human crisis or a natural crisis. And I think if you look around the world, what do we see? Regrettably, we see a multiplication of crises, of disasters. We see record numbers of refugees around the world. I think one lesson we can draw from what we observe around the world, and it's a pretty bad situation that we're looking at, is that jobs matter. You know, if there is insufficient employment opportunities, particularly for young people, particularly for young men, then that's a very unstable situation, and the dangers of conflict are there. So creating decent work is already a very strong preventive measure when it comes to conflict. But equally, when some type of disaster strikes, getting out of it is also strongly linked to providing decent work opportunities. Take the example of the cyclone that hit the Philippines recently. One of the things we had to do, and others helped us to do it, was make sure that the people who'd seen their livings destroyed, their homes destroyed, we had to get them back into some sort of productive activity, gainful activity, as quickly as possible. And that's why we chose this subject for our recommendation at the conference this year.
Now, we know that children are particularly affected when it comes to a conflict, a crisis. And in fact, this year, as every June 12th, we mark World Day Against Child Labor. And this year, the theme was protecting children who are caught up in conflict, in crisis. How can we prevent children who are caught in crisis, in conflicts, from falling victims of child labor? Okay,
well, again, there's prevention in the first place. We have to, in the ways that I've just been describing, try to avoid these crises as much as possible. But when they do hit, we absolutely understand that children are often the most vulnerable. It's by definition in such circumstances. Well, we need, in the most positive way, to target kids. That is to say, to provide them with protection, be they social protection, to make sure that educational facilities remain at their disposals, to try and keep families together, to do all of these things that in normal circumstances provide children with a sort of social infrastructure that they need to live and grow up normally. You know, there are still, you know, with or without crisis, 168 million kids around the world who are working, who are victims of child labour. And we'll be going actually to Argentina later this year for the first World Conference Against Child Labour, look at forced labour as well. And I think this will be a really important moment to re-dynamise our work against child labour. By the way, one of the really good things that happened at our conference in the margins was that India ratifies the two fundamental rights child labour conventions, numbers 138, 182. This was a great step forward. I think it shows that our campaign, our global campaign to get rid of child labour, has got plenty of energy in it.
It means also the number of kids who are now covered by the core conventions.
Listen, the 182, which is a convention which is to eradicate the worst forms of child labour, the ones that are really morally and physically damaging to kids, that convention is now ratified by countries which cover 99% of the global child population. So we're really near universal ratification of that convention. We want to extend that universal ratification to all of our fundamental rights conventions.
Great. Now, before we move on to the questions that are already coming in from our viewers, and thank you very much for sending them, I want to touch on another issue that was discussed by another one of the technical committees. We had 4 technical committees, and this one had to do with labor migration. And one thing that caught my attention, which you actually mentioned in your closing remarks, is this lack of, I think you referred to it as a governance deficit when it comes to labor migration. What do you mean by that?
Well, you know, it's strange in this era of globalization that we talk about so much. We've adopted really sophisticated rules on capital flows, on trade flows, on all of the sort of movements that we associate with globalization. But we've not really been very good with putting a governance structure in place which would govern the movement of people. This has been a massive deficit. And I don't think we should be surprised. We should be extremely worried, but we shouldn't be surprised if we see many labour rights abuses associated with the phenomenon of migration. So we have to make good these, I've called them governance deficits. And that produces another sort of situation which I think many people are familiar with. You know, there's a lot of anti-migrant and anti-migration feeling out there right now. You just look at our politics around the world. It's a toxic political atmosphere in which we deal with migration. And yet the economic case in favour of migration has never been stronger. The global economy needs more migrants, needs more migration. And the best way to reconcile these needs and people's concerns about migration is to make sure that migration is properly governed. Proper rules are in place, proper practices are in place, which can bring, you know, this famous win-win situations. That is to say, the migrants themselves win from the act of migration, and the populations who send and receive those people also draw benefits. You know, this is not a utopia. It's not something that should be beyond us, but we need to work at it. And I think our discussion on migration at the conference really moved us in the right direction.
We'll come back to the issue of migration, but before we move on to the next question, I want to read one that comes from Rashmi. And actually, all our talk about conventions and recommendations has stirred some interest. And it says, ratifying conventions is one thing.
Yep.
Now, implementing them is another. How does the ILO help countries with the latter?
Well, firstly, I agree, absolutely. Implementing is what really matters. And at our conference, we have a committee whose sole job it is to check up on countries to see how they are doing in applying conventions that they have ratified. It's called the Committee on the Application of Standards. So if you were in the conference in the last 2 weeks, you would have seen that committee calling up 24 governments to explain on the basis of an expert report why they didn't think they were doing everything they should do to apply the conventions they've ratified. And this is one of the really high points. This happens every year. This is not a once-off. It's what we call our supervisory system in action. And these are tough conversations.
This is kind of like the heart of the ILO.
It's the heart of the ILO. You know, the governments don't like being on the list very much. They take it as criticism. But they're put on the spot. They're questioned by worker and employer delegates, and the conference draws up conclusions which tells them what they expect they should do better than they have done in the past. So we don't just sit here and ratify conventions. As the questioner has said, we take a lot of care to make sure that once ratified, governments meet up to their responsibilities by applying those conventions properly.
Now, there was another committee that discussed or looked at fundamental principles and rights of at work. And would you say that if you look at the global level, is there a trend where you see people are respecting, or countries or governments are respecting more fundamental principles and rights of work? Can we talk about a global trend of more respect, less respect?
Yeah, that's a very difficult question to answer because national circumstances vary so much. But let me just begin by explaining to everybody what we mean by fundamental principles and rights. The ILO has a package of 8 conventions. We call them the core conventions, the fundamental rights conventions, and they deal with the right to organise, the right to collective bargaining, freedom from forced labour, freedom from child labour, and elimination of discrimination at work. Okay, you can see here, we're talking about human rights at work. These are human rights, and every country should be able to respect these rights. Now, what are the trends? Well, we've set ourselves a target that the conventions that I've just mentioned should be ratified by all member states of the ILO. We're not there yet. We're not there yet. But in the course of the conference, I received another 4 ratifications. So it's taking us nearer to that formal acceptance of obligations. But let's be honest, we still have problems in the world. And to go back to the numbers I mentioned earlier on, child labour, 168 million. Forced labour, 21 million. The workers would also say to us very, very clearly that half the population of the world lives in countries which have not ratified the famous Convention 87, one which gives the right to organise or protects the right to organise. So I think we can say we're making progress, but we still have an awful long way to go. And you know, nothing's ever won definitively. You know, countries move in the right direction, and then something can sort of set us back. So I think eternal vigilance is the watchword when it comes to fundamental rights, and we work hard at that.
And talking about progress, but still having a long way to go, on June 15th, last Thursday, we held our World of Work Summit, which we hold every year, and this year it was on the issue of women at work, which is a fascinating issue. And again, if we look back 30, 40 years, we've seen quite a lot of progress, but yet there's still a long way to go. And I'm thinking particularly on issues like equal pay for work of equal value. How can we speed up process in this area?
I think we were right to dedicate our special day, the 15th of June, we call it our World of Work Summit, to this issue of women at work, just for the reasons that you mentioned. You know, the ILO has been working at equality ever since we began nearly 100 years ago, and the key conventions were adopted, 60 years ago. And again, look at the numbers. You know, all this time later, the gender pay gap, if you take an average around the world, is in excess of 20%. Women, for doing the same work or equivalent work, are still paid over 20% less. It's incredible, really, when you think about it, as an injustice. The level of participation of women in labour forces is about 26 percentage points lower than that of men. So here is, I think, the dilemma we find ourselves in. We've got, most countries now have the formal legislation in place for elimination of discrimination, for equal pay. And yet the realities of labour markets are that there's still this fundamental inequality. And what we try to do in this World of Work Summit Day, and what we're trying to do in our centenary initiative on women at work, is to just work out why we still are struggling so much and what we need to do to go quicker to the final goal. And I think it's not just doing more of the same. If we did more of the same that we've been doing for the last 60 years, we're going to take a very long time to get there. So we need innovation. We need to understand better what the obstacles to equality are. Sometimes they're invisible. Sometimes they're sort of under the surface, structural reefs that aren't immediately visible. We have to get to them. And that means creativity above all.
And that, of course, it's not something that's just down to governments. I mean, here at the ILO, we work with governments, but also employers and workers. It's everyone's concern. Absolutely.
And like any of the issues that we've been talking about just now, social dialogue is a key to them all. The whole logic of the ILO. And I think what does make it special is we're not just talking to governments like everybody else in the UN does. We, yes, talk to governments, but employers and workers are at the table as well. And it's an extraordinary addition, added value to the whole process. Mind you, I must say, after this great conference, we looked at the numbers of women who came to our conference. 31%. 31% of the registered representatives were women. It's better than some years, but it's not good enough.
Yeah, no. Let's go back to some of the questions that we're getting. I want to take you back to recommendation 205.
Yep.
And it says, this is from Inesh, in concrete terms, how can this new recommendation on employment and decent work for peace and resilience improve the lives of Syrian refugees in neighboring countries and in Europe?
Very good question. In fact, one of the major discussion points in this debate, and it was one of the most difficult points, was how to deal with refugees. And there was some feeling at the beginning that maybe we had to leave refugees out of this story. But we didn't. And you will find, if you look at recommendation 205, very special attention given to refugees. Now, particularly in the light of the Syrian crisis, but let's not forget that there are refugee crises across the face of the world in the different regions. The ILO has argued that access to labour markets is something which matters a great deal to the protection and the assistance to refugees. And that's not easy. Now, in the last 2 years, I've been to Jordan, I've been to Lebanon, I've been to the south of Turkey to look at Syrian refugee communities and how their neighbouring countries where they are now being hosted try to help them. Now, the good news is, in all of those countries, efforts are being made to open labour markets to Syrian refugees. Now, that's not easy. You know, unemployment in Jordan, for example, is around the 15 to 16% mark. Jordanians need jobs too. So we have to make particular efforts. It can be employment-intensive investment programs, it can be training, it can be all sorts of approaches. But I do believe that very concretely, and the questioner asked about practical and concrete examples, it is by providing access or preparing for access to labour markets that the ILO, at least, we're not a purely humanitarian organisation, can provide genuine support to refugees, give them perspectives for the future. You know, I always, when I visit refugee camps, I ask, what do you want? I ask the families there, what do you want in your lives? And you always get the same three answers. We want to go home when it's safe, we want our kids at school, and we want to work. Work not just to get money, but to give sense to an existence which otherwise seems to sort of be frozen, to be on hold. It's a very powerful message.
Absolutely. We have another 10 minutes to go, more or less. I remind you that we're live here from the International Labour Organization. We're talking to Mr. Guy Ryder, ILO Director-General. Please do send in your question, or keep sending in your questions. And if you want to know more about the ILC, the International Labour Conference, what happened, everything we did, you can go to www.ilo.org/ILC and you get all the information, quite a lot of information there. Now, DG, let's go forward and look towards our centenary. We're about to be 100 years old in 2019. And I know one of the issues that's very dear to the ILO in these days, in fact, it's the name of another of our centenary initiatives, is the future of work.
Yeah.
Right? But it's quite a broad topic. Now, what do we talk about when we talk about the future of work here at the ILO?
Yeah, look, I think most people would agree, and it's certainly my opinion, that the world of work that we are in today is changing. It's changing, it's being transformed at a speed and on a scale and in a depth that we've never seen before. And I think people coming onto the labour market today are probably experiencing a different reality than, for example, I did when I came onto the labour market all that time ago. So if the ILO is to be serious about continuing, and we are serious, about continuing our mission to promote social justice through work, I think above all, we have to understand these transformations, we have to understand why the world of work is changing, what are the drivers, and then work out what the ILO has to do to be sure that we have the right tools, the right instruments, the right policies, the right international labour standards to keep moving forward the social justice mandate that we have. And, you know, a centenary is a good opportunity to do that. Most of the time, most of us, our governments, our workers and employers' organisations, you know, you're trying to solve the problem that's right in front of your nose, the problem that's got to be solved today or tomorrow. This centenary allows us to look maybe a year, 5 years, 10 years forward and say, where are we going and how can we shape this future? It's a real mistake to believe that future is already decided. I think the key message as we start this initiative is the future that we want is a future that we have to make. It's not something that technology or anything else will decide for us.
Talking about technology, many times when we think about the future of work, we just think of the impact that technology will have on the world of work. But, I mean, there are other issues as well that we should be concerned with.
Yeah. Technology is a big one, you know, and, you know, there are so many discussions, and I think probably this is the thing people think of immediately when you talk about the future of work, about how many jobs will be created, how many will be destroyed by technology. We're supposed to be entering, or supposed to be in, perhaps, the fourth industrial revolution. Now, many people say the previous three industrial revolutions, after all the turbulence of adjustment and change, actually produced more jobs than were destroyed. In the end, we came out better. Living standards were higher. We lived better. Now, is this fourth industrial revolution going to be the same, or will this be the industrial revolution that actually sets us back in terms of jobs? I don't think there's a yes or no answer to that, because I repeat, it depends how we treat technology. But what else is at stake? Well, climate change. We've talked about that already. Are we going to be able to transit successfully to a sustainable economy? Then there is demography, population movements. You know, many countries sitting here in Europe, we worry a lot about aging populations. But if I go to Africa or South Asia, it's about young populations and getting jobs for young people. So that's got enormous implications for us. And the other thing I think we need to think about, particularly today, is the future path of globalization. For the last 20 or 30 years, I think everybody has assumed that the future will be accelerating globalization, you know, ongoing movement towards an increasingly integrated global economy. We're hearing more and more voices saying that's not the right way to go now. We have to have more sort of separate development from countries one by one.
Sticking with the issue of the future of work, here's a question from Jeff. You kind of alluded to it, but if you could talk a bit more about the differences of how the future of work or the issues concerning the future of work will affect developing and developed countries. Does it affect them the same way, or is there a difference?
Well, you know, we have, it's an interesting question. We've even talked about saying there isn't a future of work. There will be many futures of work, depending where you come from, developing or emerging. Two things to say about that. I'm very determined that this initiative on the future of work will address not just the situation of the richest advanced countries, but also all of the developing and emerging countries as well. I say it's an initiative that must make sense not just from Silicon Valley, but from the Nile Valley as well. So we have to go into all of these issues. But, you know, if I travel to sub-Saharan Africa, you know, they're not really talking about the effects of technology in the same way as we might in the United States or in Japan. You know, they're talking about how technology can boost development, how it can deal with poverty, how it can help, for example, Africa's rural sector to become more productive and provide better livelihoods. So this is clearly an initiative that has to address all of those multiple realities. And look, we have 187 member states. 110 of those have already engaged in national dialogues on the future of work. So I think we're really living up to our responsibility to cover all of these diverse realities. Very attentive to it.
This question comes from Mark, and I think it's a simple one, but you know, quite a difficult one. What kind of advice would you give to a young person entering the labor market today?
It's not easy at
From
all.
the ILO Director-General.
It's not an easy thing at all. You know, and there is no simple answer to that. I think the first thing to do, though, is you know, don't settle for what's not good enough. You know, I really think that young people may find sometimes harsh, difficult realities on labour markets. My view is, it's the advice I give to my own family when they come onto the labour market. You've got to go for what you want. You've got to have the confidence to defend your own rights. You know, we always think that work should be an act of self-realisation. It should be something, you don't undergo it. It's something which develops you, fulfills you. I think young people should really be quite demanding, quite assertive when they go to work. Not to suffer there, not to be pushed around there, but to assert their own rights and to stick to their ambitions and expect that their ambitions should find someone who listens, circumstances which, you know, really suit what they want rather than, you know, have to be adjusted to because there's nothing better. And
just to conclude, as you know, we have the 2030 Development Agenda, which was this huge agenda that was approved in 2015 by all governments. And it looks towards 2030. There are 17 Sustainable Development Goals. What is the ILO's goal between now and 2030?
Yeah, okay, so the 2030 Development Agenda is the United Nations blueprint for development for the next, well, it's now 13 years. Yeah. We worked hard to get that agenda, as it turned out, with those 17 goals. The good news from an ILO perspective is work issues are really mainstreamed throughout the agenda. You find many of the things we've talked about, gender equality, migration, rights, they're in there, they're in the agenda. But so is a goal which simply says that all the governments of the world and the UN commit themselves to decent work and full employment, decent work for all and full employment in processes of inclusive growth. Now, I think that is a sufficiently strong message and strong commitment that the ILO has aligned its programme for the next 2 years, which was adopted by the conference, by the way, unanimously, effectively, we've aligned everything we do to realising that agenda. And so I think the ILO's interests, messages, priorities are deeply embedded in the agenda. That agenda, which implicates the whole of the international system, is now a real opportunity, a real vehicle to make the decent work message, which is our way of saying social justice in the world, the responsibility of all. We have a real opportunity here, and for the next 13 years, I think the ILO really, really, really needs to step up its game and say, this is where we're going. This is possible. People don't make commitments like this lightly. This is where the world needs to go, and we have to be part of the locomotive that takes us in that direction.
Great. DG, thank you very much for taking the time. Thank you for sending in your questions. This is it for now from Geneva, but we'll be back soon. So thank you very much. Have a great day. Goodbye.